Hello, my ravenous readers. It's Uncle Sean here. Welcome back to Kelly Street. Another week is over, but that brings us that much closer to this week's Read Aloud. Slowly but surely, together we've been growing this little channel. And if you want to help us grow it some more, you can like today's video, subscribe to Kelly Street Productions, and ring that bell icon so YouTube can notify you about future Read Alouds. You know, readers, when I first started doing Read-Alouds here on this channel, I was doing it for one ravenous reader in particular, my nephew Jesse. Reading here on YouTube let me share my love of books and my love of reading with him, even though he was living on the other side of the country. Since then, we've welcomed many more readers to our weekly get-togethers and read many more terrific books. You can probably tell by the balloons that we're celebrating because today we are finishing our reading of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, written by Roald Dahl and illustrated by Quentin Blake. The last time we read, Charlie, Grandpa Joe, and Mr. Wonka watched as the other guests headed home, each with their lifetime supply of candy. But the very last thing we heard was Mr. Wonka tell Charlie that he had something very important to talk to him about. So it looks like we're going to be learning some big news in today's chapter. What do you think Mr. Wonka wants to talk about? Well, the answer to that question will be revealed in today's chapter. Chapter 30 is called, strangely enough, Charlie's Chocolate Factory. Now that's strange because I thought it was Willy Wonka's Chocolate Factory. It's all a little confusing, but the answers we need are about to be revealed. So sit back, get comfortable, and let's read. The great glass elevator was now hovering high over the town. Inside the elevator stood Mr. Wonka, Grandpa Joe, and little Charlie. "How I love my chocolate factory," said Mr. Wonka, gazing down. Then he paused, and he turned around and looked at Charlie with the most serious expression on his face. "Do you love it too, Charlie?" he asked. "Oh yes," cried Charlie. "I think it's the most wonderful place in the whole world." "I'm very pleased to hear you say that," said Mr. Wonka, looking more serious than ever. He went on staring at Charlie. "Yes," he said, "I am very pleased indeed to hear you say that. And now I shall tell you why." Mr. Wonka cocked his head to one side, and all at once the tiny twinkling wrinkles of a smile appeared around the corners of his eyes. And he said, "You see, my dear boy, I have decided to make you a present of the whole place. As soon as you are old enough to run it, the entire factory will become yours." Charlie stared at Mr. Wonka. Grandpa Joe opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "It's quite true," Mr. Wonka said, smiling broadly now. "I really am giving it to you. That's all right, isn't it?"
"Giving it to him?"
gasped Grandpa Joe.
"You must be joking."
"I'm not joking, sir. I'm deadly serious."
But, why would you want to give your factory to little Charlie?"
"Listen," Mr. Wonka said. "I'm an old man. I'm much older than you think. I can't go on forever. I've got no children of my own, no family at all. So who is going to run the factory when I get too old to do it myself? Someone's got to keep it going, if only for the sake of the Oompa Loompas. Mind you, there are thousands of clever men who would give anything for the chance to come in and take over from me. But I don't want that sort of person. I don't want a grown-up person at all. A grown-up won't listen to me. He won't learn. He will try to do things his own way and not mine. So I have to have a child. I want a good, sensible, loving child. One to whom I can tell all my most precious candy-making secrets while I am still alive."
"So that is why you sent out the golden tickets,"
cried Charlie. "Exactly," said Mr. Wonka. "I decided to invite 5 children to the factory, and the one I liked the best at the end of the day would be the winner."
"But Mr. Wonka," stammered Grandpa Joe, "do you really and truly mean that you are giving the whole of this enormous factory to little Charlie? After all—"
"There's no time for arguments," cried Mr. Wonka. "We must go at once and fetch the rest of the family. Charlie's father and his mother and anyone else that's around. They can all live in the factory from now on. They can all help to run it until Charlie is old enough to do it by himself. Where do you live, Charlie?"
Charlie peered down through the glass elevator at the snow-covered houses that lay below. "It's over there," he said, pointing. "It's that little cottage right on the edge of the town. The tiny little one."
"I see it,"
cried Mr. Wonka, and he pressed some more buttons and the elevator shot down towards Charlie's house. "I'm afraid my mother won't come with us," said Charlie sadly.
"Why ever not?"
"Because she won't leave Grandma Josephine and Grandma Georgina and Grandpa George."
"But they must come too."
"They can't," Charlie said. "They're very old and they haven't been out of bed for 20 years.
"Then we'll take the bed along as well, with them in it,"
said Mr. Wonka.
"There's plenty of room in this elevator for a bed."
"You couldn't get the bed out of the house," said Grandpa Joe. "It won't go through the door."
"You mustn't despair,"
cried Mr. Wonka.
"Nothing is impossible. You watch."
The elevator was now hovering over the roof of the Bucket's little house. "What are you going to do?" cried Charlie.
"I'm going right on in to fetch them,"
said Mr. Wonka. "How?" asked Grandpa Joe.
"Through the roof,"
said Mr. Wonka, pressing another button. "No!" shouted Charlie.
"Stop!"
shouted Grandpa Joe. Crash went the elevator, right down through the roof of the house and into the old people's bedroom. Showers of dust and broken tiles and bits of wood and cockroaches and spiders and bricks and cement went raining down on the three old ones who were lying in bed. And each of them thought that the end of the world was come. Grandma Georgina fainted. Grandma Josephine dropped her false teeth. Grandpa George put his head under the blanket. And Mr. and Mrs. Bucket came rushing in from the next room. "Save us!" cried Grandma Josephine. "Calm yourself, my darling wife," said Grandpa Joe, stepping out of the elevator. "It's only us." "Mother!" cried Charlie, rushing into Mrs. Bucket's arms. "Mother! Mother! Listen to what's happened! We're all going to live in Mr. Wonka's factory, and we're going to help him run it, and he's given it all to me, and... What are you talking about, Charlie?" said Mrs. Bucket.
"Just look at our house,"
cried poor Mr. Bucket.
"It's in ruins."
"My dear sir," said Mr. Wonka, jumping forward and shaking Mr. Bucket warmly by the hand.
"I'm so very glad to meet you. You mustn't worry about your house. From now on, you're never going to need it again anyway."
"Who is this crazy man?" screamed Grandma Josephine. "He could have killed us all." "This," said Grandpa Joe, "is Mr. Willy Wonka himself." It took quite a time for Grandpa Joe and Charlie to explain to everyone exactly what had been happening to them all day. And even then, they all refused to ride back to the factory in the elevator. "I'd rather die in my bed!" shouted Grandma Josephine. "So would I!" cried Grandma Georgina. "I refuse to go!" announced Grandpa George. So Mr. Wonka and Grandpa Joe and Charlie, taking no notice of their screams, simply pushed the bed into the elevator. They pushed Mr. and Mrs. Bucket in after it. Then they got in themselves. Mr. Wonka pressed a button. The doors closed. Grandma Georgina screamed. And the elevator rose up off the floor and shot through the hole in the roof, out into the open sky. Charlie climbed onto the bed and tried to calm the three old people, who were still petrified with fear. "Please don't be frightened," he said. "It's quite safe, and we're going to the most wonderful place in the world." "Charlie's right," said Grandpa Joe. "Will there be anything to eat when we get there?" asked Grandma Josephine. "I'm starving. The whole family is starving." "Anything to eat?" cried Charlie, laughing. "Ha ha! Oh, you just wait and see."
Well, that's the end of Chapter 30 and the conclusion to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And I hope you've enjoyed listening to this story as much as I've enjoyed reading it to you. You know, as creative as we all know Mr. Wonka is, you think he could have come up with a better plan than crashing the elevator into the Bucket's roof and snatching up Charlie's entire family. But at least the Buckets are on their way to a much better place, and I don't think Grandma Josephine is going to have trouble finding something to eat. Well, there you have it, readers. 5 children arrived at the gates of Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, all hoping to be the winner of Mr. Wonka's mysterious prize. But in the end, only Charlie Bucket remained. Charlie went from finding a lonely dollar in the snow to winning the last golden ticket, and now he's set to be the world's next great chocolatier, following in the footsteps of Willy Wonka, who's ready to share all his candy-making secrets with our young hero. So it looks like everything worked out for little Charlie and his entire family. And even the other guests get to return home from their adventure with a lifetime supply of sweets, courtesy of Mr. Willy Wonka. Plus, maybe one of them learned an important life lesson along the way. Remember, there is no such thing as a bad child. We all have important life lessons to learn along the way to make us the best version of ourselves. You, me, everybody. Well, that's all the time we have for today's episode, but remember, there are many little ways to enlarge your world. Love of books is the best of all. Oh, in case you've been missing it, there's always something special at the end of every video, right after we cut to the picture of the Kelly Street sign. If you haven't caught it yet, you should check it out, and go see some of our old videos to see what you might have missed. Okay, let's speed this up.
We'll be back in a second, you'll see.
Well, look who's still here. Can you believe that we finished reading Charlie and the Chocolate Factory? It's been a really fun journey for me, reading this story to you one chapter at a time. And if you enjoyed it, I recommend you try reading another one of the great books written by Roald Dahl. These are imaginative stories that will pull you into exciting adventures and introduce you to fun new characters like Matilda, Danny, the champion of the world, James and his friends living inside the giant peach. Or, if you aren't quite ready to say goodbye to Willy Wonka and the Bucket Family, you can read the sequel to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, entitled Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator. Charlie has to be the youngest person in the whole world to own their own chocolate factory, and nobody has a factory quite like this one. Charlie is going to be famous, he's going to be a huge celebrity, and that reminds me of a joke. Okay, you ready? How do celebrities stay cool? They have lots of fans. Get it? See you next time.